The general walked past her and smirked. He saw a woman whose age was etched in the fine lines around her eyes, her gray-streaked hair pulled back in a severe, functional knot. She was on her knees in the dust of a supply depot, meticulously calibrating a seismic sensor with the delicate focus of a watchmaker. His gaze swept over her simple, gray contractor jumpsuit, devoid of rank or insignia, and the smirk widened into a look of faint, condescending pity. An older woman, relegated to menial work on a forward operating base at the edge of the world. He said nothing, but the expression communicated everything. It was a dismissal so complete, so utterly assured, that it hung in the air long after he and his entourage had passed. But the crisis was coming. An electronic storm was gathering on the horizon, one that cared nothing for rank or ego, and soon the general would see her again. He would see the small, tarnished badge she kept hidden, and the smirk would be replaced by a cold, paralyzing shock. The woman he had dismissed as a relic was about to become the only thing standing between his command and utter annihilation. Her name was Vance, and she had been at FOB Nightingale for 3 weeks. Her official title was Signal Integrity Analyst, a deliberately vague and boring designation that invited no questions. She was a civilian contractor, a ghost in the machine of military bureaucracy, assigned to install and maintain a new network of subterranean geophysical sensors. It was quiet work, performed in dusty depots and silent, windswept plains beyond the base's perimeter. The soldiers, mostly young men and women barely out of their teens, saw her as a fixture, like a piece of equipment that occasionally moved. They were polite but distant. She was outside their rigid world of rank and regulation, an oddity they had no framework to understand. Alara preferred it this way. The anonymity was a comfort, a cloak she had worn for so long it felt like a second skin. As she worked, her hands moved with an economy and precision that belied the simple task. She cleaned the sensor's primary lens not just by wiping it, but by following the microscopic grain of the crystal, her touch featherlight. Her focus was absolute, yet her awareness was diffuse, extending far beyond the metal shelf in front of her. Through the open bay door of the depot, she could see a section of the perimeter fence, the heat shimmering above the concertina wire. She noted the predictable patrol route of the guards, the blind spot in the coverage of Camera 7, and the way the wind, funneling through the jagged peaks of the Asmar Range, carried dust in patterns that could offer cover for an infiltrating force. She wasn't just calibrating a sensor, she was reading the pulse of the entire base. A young soldier, Corporal Kenji Tanaka, entered the depot, his boots scuffing softly on the concrete. He carried a bottle of water, beaded with condensation. "Ma'am," he said, his voice respectful. "Figured you could use this. It's hot in here." Alara looked up. Her eyes, a pale, clear gray, met his. They were unervingly still, and for a moment, Tanaka felt like he was the one being analyzed. "Thank you, Corporal," she said. Her voice was low and even, with a texture like worn stone. He placed the water beside her small, unassuming toolkit. The tools were not standard issue. They were compact, matte black, and looked impossibly sophisticated. He had the distinct impression they were her personal property, carried with her for years, perhaps decades. "No problem, ma'am," he mumbled, suddenly feeling awkward. He was about to leave when the rhythmic thumping of helicopter blades grew from a distant chop to a bass-rattling roar. 2 V-22 Ospreys were descending, kicking up a blinding storm of sand and gravel. "Looks like the general's here," Tanaka said, squinting toward the landing zone. "General Thorne. Comes through once a quarter to make sure our bunks are made." Alara gave a non-committal hum and turned back to her sensor, her attention already withdrawn. But she was listening. The change in the base's atmosphere was palpable. A nervous energy crackled through the air, a collective tensing of shoulders as the highest authority in the sector arrived to cast his judgment. Alara felt it not as anxiety, but as a data point. The base was brittle, its morale dependent on the whims of one man. It was a vulnerability, and she filed it away with all the others. General Marcus Thorne strode from the Osprey like a man carving his own path through reality. He was tall, immaculate in his crisply pressed uniform, his chest a billboard of colored ribbons. His face was sharp, predatory, with eyes that were constantly scanning for imperfections. He was followed by a nervous-looking Colonel Prentice, his aide-de-camp, who clutched a datapad like a shield. Thorne's morale tours were infamous. They were less about boosting spirits and more about terrorizing junior officers and asserting his own dominance. He moved with a purpose that bordered on aggression, his polished boots crunching on the gravel path. His tour took him through the barracks, the mess hall, and the motor pool, leaving a trail of tense, resentful silence. He found fault everywhere. A misaligned stack of crates, a private whose boots lacked the proper mirror shine, a faint trace of dust on a vehicle's dashboard. Each discovery was accompanied by a sharp, cutting remark to Colonel Prentice, loud enough for everyone in the vicinity to hear. It was a performance of power, and Thorne was its sole masterful actor. Finally, his path led him to the supply depots. He marched into Depot 4, the cavernous space where Alara was working. The sudden shift from blinding sunlight to cool shadow made him pause for a moment. His eyes adjusted and he saw her, the old woman, on her knees, working on some piece of anonymous technology. He stopped. A slow smirk spread across his lips. He turned his head slightly toward Colonel Prentice, a gesture of shared condescension. "Well, Prentice," he said, his voice dripping with false magnanimity, "it's heartening to see our civilian outreach program is a success, finding meaningful work for the local pensioners." The remark was a projectile aimed and fired with precision. The two junior officers with him chuckled nervously. Prentice managed a tight, uncomfortable smile. Corporal Tanaka, who had been lingering near the entrance, felt a flush of anger and embarrassment on Alara's behalf. He looked at her, expecting to see a flicker of hurt or indignation. He saw nothing. Alara did not look up. Her hands did not stop their meticulous work. She continued to adjust a microscopic dial on the sensor's housing, her breathing slow and even. She offered no reaction at all. It was as if the general and his pronouncement were nothing more than a gust of wind, a meaningless disturbance in the air. Her stillness was absolute, a void that absorbed his contempt and left nothing behind. For a brief second, Thorne's smirk faltered. Her utter lack of response was more unsettling than an argument would have been. It was a form of defiance he didn't understand. He had expected her to be flustered, to stammer an explanation of her presence. Instead, she had simply erased him from her reality. He narrowed his eyes, his ego pricked. He saw her plain, unadorned jumpsuit, the gray in her hair, and his initial assessment reasserted itself. She was nobody, a functionary, irrelevant. He scoffed quietly, a small puff of air, and turned on his heel. "Let's move on, Colonel. I want to inspect the TOC. I trust the real soldiers are keeping things in order." He walked past her, his shadow falling over her for a moment before he moved back into the light. He didn't give her a second thought. The incident was already forgotten, a trivial footnote in his day of command. He strode out of the depot, oblivious to the fact that the woman he had just mocked had already identified 3 critical flaws in his personal security detail's formation and a dozen ways the base could be brought to its knees. Alara waited until the sound of his boots faded completely. She finished her final adjustment, and the diagnostic light on the sensor blinked a steady, healthy green. She sat back on her heels, the stillness returning. She was not offended by the general's remark. Offense was a luxury, an emotional expenditure she had learned to do without decades ago. Instead, she had been processing. General Marcus Thorne, arrogant, overconfident, relied on intimidation rather than inspiration. His command style created an environment of fear, which in turn suppressed initiative and honest reporting from subordinates. A chain of command built on fear was a brittle one, prone to shattering under real pressure. She packed her specialized tools into their worn leather roll, each instrument clicking softly into its designated place. Her work here was done. She stood, her joints making a small protest, and walked to the depot entrance, her eyes scanning the base with a new, sharper focus. Thorne's presence hadn't insulted her. It had alarmed her. A commander like that was a liability. He was a walking, talking vulnerability, and his presence made the entire base less safe. She spent the next hour on a diagnostic walk, her official reason for touring the base's outer perimeter. She carried a datapad, pretending to check the signal strength from her newly installed sensors. In reality, she was conducting her own threat assessment. She walked the fence line, her gaze lingering on the distant, hazy mountains. The enemy in this region, the Ascendancy, was known for their sophisticated electronic warfare capabilities. They were patient, methodical, and technologically savvy. They would not announce an attack with a frontal assault. They would slide in through the cracks. And FOB Nightingale was full of cracks. Alara saw them everywhere. The primary communications array was positioned on a ridge that, while providing excellent line of sight, was also perfectly exposed to signal interception from the eastern peaks. The base's power grid had a single point of failure at the main substation, a fact anyone with a basic engineering schematic could identify. The patrol routes were timed with digital precision, making them predictable to the second. The soldiers walked with the bored, complacent slump of a garrison that hadn't seen real conflict in months. They were sleepwalking. She paused near the western guard tower, her eyes narrowed. There was a shimmer in the air, a faint, almost subliminal distortion that would be invisible to an untrained eye. It was the ghost of a passive sensor sweep, an electronic fingerprint left by an extremely high-frequency scan. Someone was mapping the base's electronic emissions with incredible detail. It was subtle, professional, and deeply unnerving. It was the whisper before the scream. Her mind, a repository of countless similar situations, began to run calculations. The sweep was a prelude. First, you map the target systems. You learn their frequencies, their encryption protocols, their digital heartbeat. Then, when you have a perfect picture, you craft your attack. Not a blunt instrument like jamming, but a scalpel. A surgical intrusion designed to turn the base's own systems against itself. She looked up at the sky, a brilliant, empty blue. Felt heavy, oppressive, like the lid of a closing box. The peace was an illusion. The war had already begun. The first shot was just silent. The attack came at 1427, precisely when the shift change in the Tactical Operations Center was at its most chaotic. It did not begin with an explosion, but with a flicker. On the main strategic display, a massive screen showing a map of the region, a single friendly drone icon blinked out of existence for a microsecond, then reappeared. The operator, a young sergeant, frowned and tapped his console, assuming it was a glitch. Then, two more icons blinked. Across the TOC, screens began to misbehave. A logistics officer's inventory screen suddenly filled with gibberish, Cyrillic characters scrolling in a waterfall of nonsense. The air traffic control console showed a dozen ghost aircraft approaching from the north, their IFF tags identifying them as Allied cargo planes that weren't scheduled to be anywhere near the sector. Panic began to prickle at the edges of the room's disciplined calm. Then the comms went down. One moment, operators were speaking clearly to patrols and air assets. The next, their headsets filled with a cacophony of noise. It wasn't static. It was worse. It was a digital mockery of their own voices, chopped, layered, and played back on a 1-second delay, creating a disorienting, maddening loop of verbal chaos. Men and women tore their headsets off, their faces pale. "What is going on?" General Thorne's voice boomed across the TOC. He stood on the command platform, his face a mask of thunderous rage. "Get me a sit rep. Prentice. Get control of your people." Colonel Prentice was barking orders, his voice tight with panic. "Reboot the primary comms server. Switch to backup channels. Someone get the EW officer in here now." But nothing worked. The backup channels were filled with the same disorienting audio loops. Rebooting the servers did nothing. The system came back online already infected, like a disease in its very code. The ghost signals on the radar multiplied, creating a picture of a massive, non-existent invasion force. The lights in the TOC flickered violently, then died, plunging the room into the terrifying, bloody glow of emergency red lighting. They were blind. They were deaf. The base's central nervous system had been expertly severed, and now they were just a collection of terrified people trapped in a metal box, waiting for the physical attack that was sure to follow. The professionals were panicking. The protocols had failed, and the general, for all his authority, was as helpless as the lowest private. In the relative quiet of the depot, Alara felt the attack as a physical sensation. It was a sudden pressure in her sinuses, a high-frequency whine at the very edge of her hearing, a fundamental wrongness in the ambient electronic noise of the base. The lights above her flickered in the same rhythm as the ones in the TOC. She straightened up, her face devoid of expression, but her eyes sharp with a familiar, cold fire. This was it. The whisper had become a scream. She didn't run. She walked. Her pace was deliberate, unhurried, yet she moved with an astonishing efficiency, her path from the depot to the central command building seemingly pre-calculated to avoid the pockets of chaos and confusion that were erupting across the base. Soldiers were running, shouting, their faces etched with fear and uncertainty. Alara moved through them like a stone in a frantic river, untouched and unmoved. She bypassed the main entrance to the TOC, where panicked guards were trying to enforce security protocols that no longer made sense. She went around to a side maintenance hatch, one she had noted earlier. It was secured with a standard digital lock, now dead and useless. A young officer was struggling with a manual override key, his hands shaking too much to fit it into the slot. Alara approached him from behind. "Allow me," she said, her voice calm and steady. The officer, startled, stepped back without thinking. Alara didn't use a key. She pulled a thin, metallic probe from a sleeve pocket, inserted it into the seam of the door's control panel, and gave a sharp, precise twist. There was a soft click, and the heavy door swung open. The officer stared, dumbfounded. Alara was already inside. She ignored the bedlam of the main command floor. Her destination was the server room, tucked away in a sublevel, a place of whirring fans and cold, sterile air. The room was empty. In their panic, everyone had focused on the terminals in the TOC, not the core hardware where the battle was actually being fought. She scanned the racks of servers, her eyes taking in the frantic, meaningless blinking of their status lights. The enemy's intrusion was elegant. It wasn't a brute force attack. It was a parasitic code that had woven itself into the operating system's most fundamental processes. Trying to fight it with the system's own diagnostic tools was like trying to perform surgery on yourself with infected hands. Alara ignored the modern, glowing consoles. Her gaze settled on a forgotten corner of the room, on a piece of equipment covered in a dusty tarp. It was an old diagnostics terminal from 2 generations of hardware ago, a relic with a monochrome CRT screen and a heavy, clacking mechanical keyboard. It had been decommissioned years ago but never removed. Crucially, it operated on a completely different architecture and connected to the servers through a low-level serial port, an analog backdoor that the attackers, in their focus on the modern network, would have overlooked. She pulled the tarp off. With the calm precision of a surgeon, she took her custom toolkit from her jumpsuit pocket. She unrolled it, revealing a collection of strange and esoteric instruments. She selected a small, triangular-headed driver and opened a panel on the side of the old terminal. She then produced a custom-made cable from another pocket, a thick black cord with a multi-pinned connector on one end and a vicious-looking data clamp on the other. She attached the clamp to a thick bundle of primary network cabling, then plugged the other end into a port she had just exposed on the old terminal. She flipped a heavy toggle switch. With a low hum and a crackle of static, the green monochrome screen flickered to life. It displayed no friendly graphics, no icons or windows. Just a single, blinking cursor in a sea of black. Alara placed her fingers on the keyboard. They hovered for a second, still and poised. Then they began to move. And on the screen, streams of raw machine code, the pure language of the system, began to flow. She hadn't just opened a door. She had stepped onto the battlefield itself. Corporal Tanaka had been given a pointless task by a frantic lieutenant. Run to the motor pool and confirm, verbally, that the vehicle fleet was secure. a task made nonsensical by the fact that the primary threat was not physical. As he hurried back, cutting through a service corridor, he saw the open door to the server room. He saw the strange, old woman from the depot, Vance, silhouetted against the green glow of a monitor he didn't recognize. He stopped, curious. He watched from the doorway, not wanting to disturb her. Her focus was absolute. Her face, illuminated from below, was a study in concentration. Her fingers moved over the keyboard in a blur, not with the frantic pecking of a novice, but with the fluid, confident grace of a concert pianist. On the screen, lines of code scrolled past faster than he could read. But he could see a pattern. He saw streams of angry, chaotic red text, the intrusion, being met, contained, and dismantled by disciplined columns of green text that flowed from her fingertips. She wasn't just typing. She was fighting. She was hunting the enemy code through the digital labyrinth of the base's network, cornering it and eradicating it. Awestruck, Tanaka ran to the TOC. He found the same lieutenant who had given him the errand. "Sir," he said, breathless. "The civilian contractor, the woman from the depot. She's in the server room. I think she's fixing it." The lieutenant, haggard and stressed, waved him away. "We have specialists working on it, Corporal. Get out of the way." "But sir, the specialists are all up here. She's on some old machine, and he trailed off, unsure how to describe what he'd seen. "You should see it." Desperate for any sliver of hope, the lieutenant toggled his console to the internal security feed for the server room. The camera was grainy, but the image was clear enough. He saw Ilara. He saw the ancient terminal. And on the main strategic display behind him, which had been a mess of false signals, a small sector in the northeast corner suddenly cleared. The ghost signals vanished. A single, true friendly drone icon reappeared, blinking a steady, healthy blue. "Holy," the lieutenant whispered. He showed the feed to his captain. The captain showed it to Colonel Prentice. Word spread through the TOC like wildfire. A murmur went through the room as operators, one by one, turned to look at the security feed on the main screen. General Thorne, whose face had been a mask of impotent fury, saw the cleared sector on the map. He saw the operators pointing at the image of the old woman. "Who is that?" he demanded. "A civilian contractor, sir," Prentice stammered. "An analyst. She's not authorized to access the core systems. She seems to be the only one accomplishing a damn thing," Thorne snarled. He stormed off the command platform, his face grim. He was going to the server room to see for himself, to find out who this woman was who dared to touch his systems and, impossibly, seemed to be saving them. He stopped dead in the doorway, his tirade dying in his throat. He saw her, bathed in the green light, her expression one of utter, predatory focus. The chaos and shouting in the TOC was a hurricane, and this small, cold room was its eye. For the first time all day, General Thorne hesitated, a seed of profound doubt planted in his mind. Just as Ilara was methodically untangling the web of malicious code, the nature of the attack shifted. The enemy, realizing their initial intrusion was being countered, escalated with brutal efficiency. The chaotic ghost signals and comms interference had been a distraction, a feint to draw the base's attention. Now they struck at the heart. A new alarm, a piercing, high-frequency siren, shrieked through the TOC. It was an alert no one on this base had ever heard for real. A CRAM warning. The base's phalanx CRAM system, an automated, radar-guided Gatling gun designed to shred incoming rockets and mortar shells, was activating. But there were no incoming projectiles. On a diagnostic screen, an operator watched in horror. "Sir, the CRAM's targeting AI. It's compromised. It's acquiring a friendly target." The gun, mounted on a tower in the center of the base, began to swivel, its multi-barreled cannon tracking with lethal speed. Its target, the base's primary satellite uplink dish, their only remaining connection to the outside world. The parasitic code wasn't just blinding them anymore. It was turning their own guardian into an executioner. "Shut it down. Manually override it," Colonel Prentice yelled, his voice cracking with desperation. "We can't, sir," a technician shouted back. "The shutdown command is being firewalled. It's locked out." The gun was seconds from firing on itself. It would be the final, humiliating act in their complete and utter defeat. In that moment of supreme crisis, General Thorne's gaze flickered from the panicked faces in the TOC to the still figure of Alara Vance in the server room, visible on the security feed. She was the only variable, the only thing that had worked. His entire career had been built on control, on rigid adherence to protocol. Now, faced with absolute failure, he had to choose between his ego and the survival of his base. He looked at Prentice, who was about to order someone to physically cut the power to the gun, a move that would leave them completely defenseless. "Belay that order." Thorne's voice was a low growl that cut through the noise. He pointed at the server room feed. "Let her work." It was the most difficult command he had ever given. It was an admission of failure and a desperate, blind bet on an unknown. Alara felt the second attack like a punch to the gut. The new code was different. It was aggressive, brutish, and incredibly fast. It had bypassed her nascent firewalls and embedded itself directly into the weapon control system. Her fingers, which had been moving with methodical grace, became a blur. The lines of green text on her screen scrolled at an impossible speed. She was no longer just defending. She was racing the firing mechanism of the gun itself. She didn't try to delete the malicious code. There was no time. Instead, she did something far more complex. She built a cage around it. With a flurry of keystrokes, she isolated the section of the network the CRAM's AI was using and created a virtual sandbox, a digital copy of the system's environment. Then, with another command, she shunted the hostile code into that sandbox. The enemy AI, thinking it was still in control of the physical weapon, issued the fire command. But inside the sandbox, the command led not to a firing pin, but to a logic loop Alara had just constructed. The command was fed back into the AI's own decision matrix as a new, nonsensical query. The AI tried to process it, failed, and issued the command again, which was again fed back to it. She had trapped it in a recursive paradox, forcing it to fight a circular battle against itself in a digital prison, leaving the real weapon inert. On the diagnostic screen in the TOC, the firing countdown froze at 2 seconds. The targeting reticle, which had been locked on the satellite dish, wavered and then snapped back to a neutral central position. The CRAM gun swiveled slowly back to its standby orientation. The piercing alarm cut off, replaced by a silence that was even more shocking. With a final, sharp tap of the enter key, Alara sent a purge command through the entire network, a kill switch that eradicated the last vestiges of the now-trapped hostile code. The ghost signals on the main display vanished in an instant. The comms hissed, and then a clear, calm voice from a perimeter patrol came through. "TOC, this is Patrol 4. What the hell was all that noise?" The lights in the TOC flickered once, then came on at full, steady brightness. The crisis was over. Alara leaned back from the ancient terminal. The green screen now showed a single, simple message she had typed. "System secure." A single bead of sweat traced a path down her temple, the only outward sign of the immense strain she had been under. She calmly reached over, disconnected her custom cable, and coiled it with practiced ease. She closed the panel on the old terminal and stood up, her movements as deliberate as ever. The server room was quiet again, the fans humming a peaceful, orderly tune. The silence in the TOC was absolute, profound. The operators, technicians, and officers stood frozen, staring at their now perfectly functional screens. They looked at each other, then at the security feed, where the old woman was simply putting her tools away. General Thorne walked from the TOC, across the short corridor, and into the server room. His stride was no longer arrogant. It was slow, heavy, the walk of a man who has just witnessed something that has fundamentally shaken his understanding of the world. Colonel Prentice and a few other officers followed at a respectful distance, crowding the doorway. Thorne stopped a few feet from Alara. He looked at her, at the plain gray jumpsuit, the worn face, the calm, clear eyes. He looked at the ancient, dead terminal she had used to defeat an attack that had brought his multi-billion-dollar command center to its knees. "Who in God's name are you?" he asked. His voice was not a demand. It was a plea, a genuine, desperate need to understand. Alara met his gaze. She didn't speak. She simply reached into the collar of her jumpsuit and pulled out the thin lanyard that held her contractor ID. It had been tucked inside, hidden from view. She held it up for him to see. The laminated card was unremarkable. Her picture, her name, Alara Vance, and her meaningless title. But pinned to the fabric of the lanyard, just below the plastic card, was a small, tarnished silver pin. It was old, worn smooth in places. Its shape was strange, an abstract design that looked like a whisper of smoke or a fleeting ghost. Etched into its center, so small it was almost invisible, was the composite head of a lion, a goat, and a serpent. Chimera. Thorne stared at it, frowning. The symbol meant nothing to him. It wasn't a unit patch or a rank insignia he recognized. It was just a piece of old metal. From the doorway, a voice spoke, halting and filled with awe. It was Master Sergeant Cole, the base's grizzled, 50-year-old communications chief, a man who had been in the service since before most of the soldiers on the base were born. He had been watching from the back, drawn by the commotion. His face was pale, his eyes fixed on the pin. "Sir," Cole said, his voice trembling slightly, "that pin, that's a chimera." Thorne didn't take his eyes off Alara. "What is chimera, Master Sergeant?" Cole swallowed hard, his voice dropping to a near whisper, as if speaking a sacred name. "Task Force Chimera, sir. They weren't real. Not officially. A Black Ops unit from the Ares conflict 25 years ago. They specialized in, well, this electronic warfare, network intrusion, direct action against command and control targets. They were ghosts, sir. Legends. They said a single Chimera operative could dismantle an entire enemy division without firing a shot." He took a half-step into the room, his eyes wide with disbelief. "They said their commander was a woman, the one who built the unit from the ground up, the best there ever was. They had a call sign for her." Cole's gaze lifted from the pin to Alara's face, his expression one of dawning, terrifying realization. "They called her Nyx." The name hung in the air. Nyx, the primordial goddess of the night, an entity so powerful even the other gods feared her. General Thorne went rigid. The name, the task force, the impossible skill, it all coalesced in his mind with the force of a physical blow. He looked from the small, silver chimera pin to Alara Vance's face, and the memory of his smirk in the depot hours earlier burned in his mind with a white-hot shame. He hadn't been looking at a pensioner. He had been looking at a titan, a living legend from the military's darkest, most secret histories. A woman whose real file was probably classified so far above his own pay grade that he couldn't even confirm her existence. A woman who had forgotten more about warfare than he would ever know. The blood drained from his face. His carefully constructed world of rank, protocol, and authority crumbled into dust. He was a general, yes, but in the presence of this woman he was a novice. He was a student. Slowly, with a gravitas that stunned everyone watching, General Marcus Thorne drew himself to his full height. He snapped his heels together. His hand came up, fast and sharp, and stopped beside his brow in the most precise, unwavering salute he had ever rendered in his entire life. It was not the perfunctory gesture he gave to subordinates. It was not the respectful salute he gave his superiors. This was different. This was a salute of profound, unadulterated reverence. A salute to a master. Seeing the general's action, Colonel Prentice, his face a mask of shock, immediately snapped to attention and saluted as well. In the TOC, the operators who were watching on the feed saw it. The captain on the command platform saw it. One by one, every uniformed soldier in the command center and the adjoining corridor turned to face the server room. A silent ripple effect of motion, until more than 50 soldiers, from the highest-ranking officer to the lowest-ranking private, were standing at perfect attention, their hands raised in a unified, silent salute to the quiet woman in the gray jumpsuit. Corporal Tanaka, standing in the back, felt tears well in his eyes. He snapped his own salute, his arm trembling with the sheer weight of the moment. Alara looked at Thorne, at the sea of saluting soldiers. She was a civilian now. She did not return the gesture. Instead, she gave a single, small, almost imperceptible nod. It was an acknowledgement, an acceptance, a quiet closing of a circle. And in the profound, respectful silence of the command center, it was more powerful than any speech. The moment passed as quietly as it had arrived. The general lowered his salute, his expression now one of deep, contemplative respect. The other soldiers followed suit, slowly turning back to their stations. But the atmosphere had changed permanently. The fear and panic were gone, replaced by a quiet, steady confidence. The base no longer felt like a fragile cage. Felt safe. Felt guarded. Alara did not linger for praise or explanations. She turned, walked past the general, who instinctively took a half-step back to clear her path, and left the server room. She walked through the now orderly TOC, the soldiers parting before her, their eyes following her with a mixture of awe and reverence. She said nothing. Her presence was all the statement she needed. General Thorne watched her go, his gaze fixed on her retreating back. He turned to Master Sergeant Cole, his voice low and urgent. "Cole, my office. Now, you will tell me every story, every rumor, every whisper you have ever heard about Task Force Chimera." Cole nodded, his face still pale. "Yes, sir." Alara walked back across the compound, the afternoon sun casting long shadows. The base was humming with a new kind of energy, one of purpose and relief. She returned to the cool, dusty quiet of Depot 4. Her seismic sensor sat on the bench, its green light blinking with steady reassurance. She picked up a soft polishing cloth and, as if nothing had happened, went back to cleaning the lens, her movements just as methodical, just as precise as they had been that morning. Later, as twilight began to bleed purple and orange across the peaks of the Asmar Range, Corporal Tanaka appeared at the depot entrance. He said nothing. He simply placed a tray on the bench next to her. On it was a hot meal from the mess hall, a real steak, not the usual processed fare, and a fresh, cold bottle of water. He met her eyes for a second, gave a short, respectful nod, and then walked away, leaving her in peace. Alara looked at the meal, then out at the darkening landscape. The world was settling into shadow, the domain of Nyx. She reached up and touched the small silver pin still attached to her lanyard. It was cool against her fingertips. The last ray of sunlight lanced through the depot door and caught the worn metal, making the Chimera's head glint with a brief, fierce light before being swallowed by the encroaching night. Her work was not done. It was never done. She was the guardian in the shadows, the quiet professional, her value proven not by rank or recognition, but by competence and action. She picked up her fork. The silence was her shield, and the respect, finally earned, was her reward.